Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're really pleased to have you here with us today for a discussion of Serenade, a Balanchine Story by Toni Bentley. Before we get started, just a very brief word on YIVO. YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which are used by researchers around the world. And we have a variety of classes, public programs, and exhibits that bring to life the world of those collections. And thank you for joining us. Please check out our fall calendar. We've got a lot of really interesting, exciting stuff coming up, including over 40 classes if you're looking to learn Yiddish or brush up on Jewish history and Jewish culture. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our Executive Director, Jonathan Brent.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in from all over the world and all over the United States. This is a program very dear to my heart. And yet, some of you may be wondering why the subject of Balanchine Serenade is appropriate to the YIVO Institute, as Alex described it a little bit earlier. So let me give you a little bit of background. I had been an editor at Yale University Press, and this book was, I believe, one of the very last that I signed up at Yale before I left to become director of the YIVO Institute. A year or so after I had been director here, I got a note from Toni Bentley that she was coming to do some research on her grandfather, Leonhard Cohn-Halberstam, who had been a member of the German High Court before the war, and wondered whether there might be any overlap with any materials at YIVO. I checked in our archives, and at that time, one of our archivists, Leo Greenbaum, heard that Toni Bentley was coming and immediately searched all of our materials for anything having to do with Balanchine. And it turns out that indeed we had a very curious document from Balanchine in our archive. And if Jane or Julia, if you would put it up so people could see it, this is a document that is in a collection that we have from the Soviet Jewish Refugee Board. I believe that's the name of the organization. And Balanchine submitted this query to them in August 1944, searching for the whereabouts of his family members. As you can see, his mother, his brother, and sister. And so we showed it to Toni with the thought that, well, if Balanchine sent this to the Soviet Jewish organization, possibly there's a Jewish connection. And in any case, we kept in touch over the progress of the book, and in due course, it was not published by Yale University Press, but by Pantheon, a very good home, I would say, and a beautiful publication. And now I have the enormous pleasure of introducing Toni Bentley to the larger YIVO community. I know it's a community in which there are many who are very interested in the history of ballet, the history of Balanchine, who of course was a close associate of Lincoln Kirstein, who was Jewish. And so there is much for us to talk about. But I want to start by saying something about the book itself before introducing Toni. The book is not a study per se. The book is not a history per se. The book is not a memoir simply of Toni's time Dancing with Balanchine and Dancing Serenade. The book is not simply an account of the history, Serenade's place in the history of ballet. It is a very special book because in a way it combines features of all of these different genres into a very, very deep contemplation, not just of something that, as Toni points out throughout the book, Balanchine really rejected, which is, what is the meaning of it? This American obsession with meaning, as I think he put it at one point. And yet, what this book is a deep contemplation of precisely that meaning, without giving that meaning a name, without giving that meaning a little box to sit in, but rather the larger implications of it in ballet, in Toni's life, in the history of art itself. And therefore the book, because it unites all of these elements, has a very, to me, evocative and special character, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit before the end of this session. I want to start, though, by introducing you, some of you may not know who Toni Bentley is, to a little bit of her biography. Toni, of course, danced with George Balanchine at the New York City Ballet for 10 years. And she's the author of 5 previous books, all of which have been notable publications in many different ways, some memoiristic, some not. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's had many articles published in the New Yorker, in the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal. She's written about a myriad of different subjects, and she has written about them all with great brilliance and with great energy and acuity. And she has brought all of those enormous gifts now to bear on the subject of Serenade, which in many ways can be considered Balanchine's masterpiece. It was a ballet that he continued to revise throughout the course of his entire life. And yet, I guess my first question, Toni, is why did it take so long? Why was it so difficult to write about this for you? Many would think it's the most easy thing for you to write about.
Well, first I want to say hello, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very honored that for you to present me in my book at YIVO, and for you, Jonathan, to be part of that, and for everybody listening from around the world. It's really wonderful. In answer to your question, well, the fact is it took 15 years. The book was first signed up by you, Jonathan, who I consider to be the godfather of the book, for sure. And I did not write it. I wasn't working on it for 15 years. It probably took, in fact, maybe 2 years of actual writing. But of course, it was in my mind the whole time. I think the reason it took me so long is because I didn't know how to do it. It started out, as you know, at Yale with the idea of it was suggested to me I write about Balanchine, and I knew that was a subject far bigger than my particular talents were good for. It's a huge, huge life of one of the 2 or 3 top artists of the 20th century, and the greatest artist in all the history of ballet. With Petipa as a close second or perhaps equal, but otherwise there's these 2 towering figures in the history of the whole art. So it started out as I would do a history of the ballet, which was, I think, a good idea, and that is in the book. But I dread boring books. I dread boring ballet books that would do something to ballet is not always considered that accessible to a lot of people, both to see or they feel maybe they don't understand it. So I didn't want to do a laundry list of, oh, the costumes changed in 1943 to longer and then shorter, and then the hair changed and then the casting changed. I didn't want to do that because it's like a laundry list. Lincoln Kirstein used to call a lot of biographies laundry lists of facts. So I didn't know how to do it. And also the other big reason was I felt inadequate because Balanchine was my, aside from my actual father, was my father in a bigger way of everything, as he was for all of us. I came into his world when I was 10 years old, and I left the company when I was 26 years old. So for 16 of my most formative years, he was the guiding light, as he was for all of us, of our entire lives. Our education, school was very much on the back burner. I had a terrible academic education because ballet was, the only thing of interest. And so I had lived this world. I had known this man a little bit. Many knew him much better than me, but I had lived in this world he created, this moral world of extreme beauty and extreme hard work. And I loved him, as we all did and still do. We're all very connected, those of us who were chosen by him. And having danced this magnificent work, inevitably, I was going to fail at conveying all of that into words, powerful as words are, and much as I love them and can't live without them. So I didn't know how to do it. So I really did think it was going to be the one book I had started that I'd never finished, which of course doesn't feel good to a writer. And then at some point, just a few years ago, I decided I'm going to really get it off my desk, so to speak, or I'm going to write it. And then I made the decision. It may sound small, but for me, it was very, very big and difficult to write the book I wanted to write, not the book I should write, not the book that would be worthy of Balanchine, whatever that means, or of the ballet or of Tchaikovsky. I just said, I'm going to follow my instincts, which of course feel like, well, who am I? Excuse me. So that's what I did. And that produced, I think, this rather eclectic mix that you're talking about. I put in the, things about my own life there as a young dancer and my own personal worries and strivings as a dancer. I put in my meetings with him, which were very, quite brief, but all meaningful as they are to a young dancer. And the dancing of the ballet. And I knew I wanted to present the ballet from on stage, from inside the dancer's body, from the first arm thing of trying to convey to the audience the great challenge in words to try and convey what it's like to be inside the ballet, inside the dancer's body. Because that is one thing as a writer that I have that's somewhat or rather unique, an ability to translate into words something that is three-dimensional, maybe four-dimensional, and that happens in a given moment of time and then is past. So once I kind of got the courage, or it was kind of the courage or it's this or nothing, on the edge of the cliff, I made the choice to just put in. So I wrote about Tchaikovsky because I love him. And I wrote about Marie Taglioni because I love her. I wrote about things that I loved, taking to me the big chance of, would that work as a book? And of course, would it be of interest and work for other people? But it was the only way I could finally do it.
You write in the book that everything that's beautiful is perched on a precipice. It's a beautiful line.
Thank you.
Describe this precipice.
Yes. He put us there every day, literally balancing, right, as we are on our toes, this great phenomena of ballerinas dancing on their tips of their toes in their point shoes. So it's certainly, and it's an incredible metaphor for, I think, for great art, for the striving for great art, for great beauty, constant improvement. And also to me, great beauty is usually something that's, way beyond what might be pretty or pleasing. but great beauty always has maybe a slightly tragic element or an element of sadness and loss around it that really, and with ballet, the transience of the art form, excuse me, I think it's really, this all chokes me up a little. Hold on, I'm going to have a sip. That it seems to me that it's the most transient art form. If you think of writing, poetry, sculpture, painting, music is written down very precisely. Ballet really doesn't even exist, which was one of Balanchine's great points. So the transience of the art form itself, and then witnessed in a ballet like Serenade, can be very deeply moving, because it echoes our own transience on this earth, and it reaches to a lot of places that are difficult to talk about, difficult to write about.
But one of the things that you point out again and again throughout the evolution of the creation of Serenade, and in a way, Serenade is always being created. It's in a constant state of recreation by Balanchine, is the role that chance plays. And that there is, in addition to the geometrical or the physical tension of being on point, and the rest of the physicality of the ballet, there's also chance. 17 dancers, for instance, 17 ballerinas, one of whom falls by accident. Why don't you explain or talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a fascinating element, that it certainly connects this ballet with so much else in the history of modern art as well.
Yes, and it really speaks to a demonstration of Balanchine's genius. We're always, once we decide someone's a genius, and nobody questions that about Balanchine, it's eternally interesting to try and look at what are these components, as if we will find the secret, because in the end, I think it's not obtainable to us to understand. But what you're referring to is how he took, and he did this all his life. In Serenade, there's very notable examples where he let chance, as opposed to coming in the room with a set idea. He knows the music, he knows what he wants to do. I want 16 girls, because ballet is almost, it's a very geometric art, is almost always 16 girls, 4 girls, 2 girls, soloists, you might have one girl or a partnering couple, but it's always even numbers. So he had 17 girls in the studio in 1934 in March, half of them in bathing suits, not well trained, not like we were at the end when we became like real Balanchine thoroughbreds after the school had been there so long. He had 17 show up. So most people would have used 16 and made one an understudy, but he said, I'm going to use everyone, because everybody's mother wants to see them. So he formulated 2 diamonds, and the center girl, the 17th girl, one could say, is the corner point of the 2 diamonds. And it's a famous opening of when the curtain goes up. To this day, whether you've seen it many times or it's your first time, the audience audibly does an intake of breath. It's so beautiful. You can see every dancer. They're actually in about 4 rows, but everyone is staggered, but symmetrically, so that you can see them all. And at different points in the ballet, when he wants 16, one girl disappears, and you have to be an insider to know when she disappears and suddenly there's 16. So he morphs it around. And the other example you mentioned is, yes, a girl, as often happens in ballet, slipped and fell and started crying early in a rehearsal. And he said, stay there. As opposed to, and of course, you cry when you fall, usually not because you've hurt yourself, but, so embarrassing, you're a ballerina. The last thing you do is want to, land on your rear end. You feel sort of inept. But he obviously, in that moment, in the music, she fell, and he obviously immediately saw something completely unplanned. He kept it. And it's one of the many iconic moments in the ballet now that would not have been there. And there are others. One girl came late to rehearsal. There were a lot of jokes about how she had a date and she was coming to rehearsal late. And and 16 girls were recreating the opening of 17, and she came in and she started walking around looking for where to go. And that is an exquisite moment in the ballet where a girl who then does get sort of separated out as one of the 3 solo dancers looks for her place among the group, which is also very, very beautiful. And then she finds it, she stands there and she joins all of us with the same arm thing. But then she's separated off as that's actually the waltz girl, we call her. There were many of these things in Serenade.
So in a sense, maybe that precipice that you refer to, that beauty is perched on, is a precipice of the need of the artist to make a choice.
Yes.
The choice to go this way or to go that way.
Yes.
And those are the choices of genius that Balanchine made. Use this. He could easily have said, no, get out of here. I'll be 16. You're late. You can't come in. And so on and so forth. But
and he would have still made a beautiful ballet, but not the one we have. And
right.
And also this ballet, like other works of great art, looks to be as if born this way. Like, and he famously said he learned right prior to that. So he was made it in 1934. He was 30 years old and he had just arrived a few months earlier from Europe via boat. They almost didn't let him in at Ellis Island. And he had escaped at age 20 from Bolshevik Russia after a great deal of suffering and starvation and tuberculosis he got in Europe. He worked with Diaghilev. He was Diaghilev's last choreographer. And during that time, he did his first great masterpiece, Apollo, where he worked with Stravinsky, who was, aside from Tchaikovsky, his other great sort of Russian musical spiritual father. But it was unlike Tchaikovsky, who died 10 years before Balanchine was born. Their lives, Stravinsky was older, but they communed and made many works together, which are some of the glories of what Balanchine produced at New York City Ballet. But he said then that he learned with Apollo, that I'm slightly paraphrasing this, that he learned about how he could eliminate everything but what was essential. This is a very profound thing. We overwrite, we overspeak, that he learned so early on about editing down to the essential. And so when you look at Serenade, you really can't imagine that it could be otherwise. It's like when you look at it, it's the best ballet you've ever seen. Now, of course, if you look at another great Balanchine ballet, like Concerto Barocco, you will have the same feeling. This is one of the notes of genius, I think.
Mm-hmm. And his love of Tchaikovsky and his working with Stravinsky and so on and so forth, this is well known. But you also write about his, I think, and maybe I'm not quoting correctly, his letting the hips of the jazz age into.
Oh, absolutely.
And he loved Charlie's Angels.
Oh, yes. He loved American TV. He loved Westerns. He always wore turquoise bracelets, and he wore the kind of those ties with the turquoise at the top and the strings. He loved Westerns.
He was letting the world into what could have been a very hermetic enclave of high culture. He was letting the actual world into it. Constantly.
Oh yes, I think he said at one time the vulgar, something to the effect of the vulgar can be very useful, but you have to know how to use it. Of course, he was incapable of vulgarity. Though there were one or two ballets where some people might disagree, but yes, he was no snob. I mean, he was an intensely cultured man. He'd absorbed all of in his youth, all of the czarist kind of culture at the Mariinsky Theater. He met the Tsar when he was a young boy in a gold carriage, and the Tsar gave them chocolates and they all clicked their heels, and met the Tsar's family. This was the last Tsar before they all were, murdered. And then, as I say, he had this life where he met Derain and Berard and Matisse. He worked with all of them, Chilichev in Europe, and then came to America. So he had absorbed, and all of ballet history he had absorbed. So he was a deeply cultured man and read a lot of books, but he never talked about it. He was very famously, sort of people had no choice, but in interviews, he was not forthcoming. He did not speak the way you and I are speaking. He was a sly fox. He would say usually something very, when they always said to him, what's the meaning of Serenade? Because Serenade, there are no notes. Like when you go to Giselle, it tells you the story in the program. He said there's no story. It's a dance in the moonlight, which is already a little bit of a story for him. But the ballet is story after story, drama after drama. And as you age, they change. As you see it, they change. So he knew, you don't set the story. There are references to Cupid and the myth of Cupid and Psyche. There is a lot in the last section at the elegy. There's 4 sections of the ballet. There is a great deal of Sturm und Drang, romantic, about with a man and 2 women, a man and 3 women, and they seem to be all fighting over him, and then he chooses one, but then his destiny has other plans. There's a dark angel. There's enormous amount of drama, but he always said it's just a dance in the moonlight, which of course leaves each individual person over time who views the ballet to, he or she is free to see whatever. And Balanchine also famously said, as the music was #1 for him, sometimes to our consternation, because in other we had to follow the conductor. Most companies, the conductor follows the dancers, but our conductor led our tempos. He forgot what I was going to say. I got lost with, the way we had to follow the conductor was like, Mr. B would tell him what to do, and we'd have to chase the music, because Balanchine liked it fast. He was very 20th century in that way.
Right. I'd like to talk a little bit, switching for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
You write the book in a very specific way. You could have written it in many different ways, and I imagine you thought about how to write the book. You could have written it thematically. You could have written it historically. You could have written it memoiristically. And as I said before, and it's obvious, you put a bit of all of this in, but instead you choose to write it almost second by second or minute by minute.
Yeah.
Which is fantastic. It's a fantastic way of getting into the ballet. At 3 minutes and 33 seconds, this is what happens. And then all of a sudden, we switch to a discourse on Petipa, or on Tchaikovsky, or on some of the great ballerinas who performed for Balanchine, and so on and so forth. So describe a little bit your strategy in doing it this way.
Well, it came to me pretty early on, as I mentioned earlier, about writing about the ballet from the stage. So that the way the book starts is with we're backstage getting ready. It's very in the moment, the ballet, none of that history, the history of Serenade or anything like that. It's me being the dancer that I was. And so the basic structure of the book, as I see it, is that from the book goes from the beginning to the end of the ballet with all these kind of, as if the ballet, the structure of Serenade, which could not be improved, of these 32 plus minutes and seconds, is the tree trunk of the structure of the book. And then I just go off on all these various branches, as you say, of the things that I wanted to talk about that were interesting or funny or notable or something. so I did have that as my tie-in, and then where I place different things about Tchaikovsky, about toe shoes. I do quite a long a chapter
But
about
the discourse on toe shoes is really fantastic. It's fantastic. I mean, the way you get into the glue and the burlap and this kind of toe shoe as opposed to that kind of toe shoe. It
Yeah.
really takes you into the life of the ballet through the object.
Yes, yes. Well, they are, I mean, I suppose along with the famous tutu, of which there's many forms, they are perhaps the greatest symbol of the ballerina that separates her from, in fact, I didn't set this up, but see, I have here a pair, and these are actually Suzanne Farrell's toe shoes, not mine. I have some of those around too. You see the elastic has gotten stretched out. They're from the 80s. But they are a magnificent shoe. And there's nothing like it. You know, they come, the two come the same. Can you imagine her foot was in here? It really feels like a sacred object to me. See, and when they come, the two are the same. They have no ribbons and elastic. We sew on the ribbons and elastic where we want it, how we want it. So this is all Suzanne's stitching inside here that she would have done. We didn't have anyone doing that for us. I mean, very young ones sometimes had their stage mothers do it, but we didn't. But yeah, you can see her big stitches. We used crochet thread, so it was very strong. And then we would take out this is not the normal inside. We would take out a piece and they would be stiff like a rock. And then we would break them, right? So you could stand on point. We would crack the shoes, and we would cut out, you see here at the end, the end of the satin is cut out. We do that before we ever get into class or on stage, because it will inevitably rip when we run around and twirl on it, because that's what we're standing on. So we cut the beautiful satin out right to begin with, because otherwise you could trip on it or something, because it'll tear within a couple of minutes of dancing. And then we scrape. Can you see on the back here, all these scrapes? We all have these scrapers. Suzanne had a scraper. We would scrape all these lines on this bit of leather so that we get more traction. And there's also a date on here, because they were made by, each of us had our own maker who we never met. They were at Freed's factory in England, but they were denoted by a sign. Hers says 3-5. I had like A, I mean, they changed around, and then it's stamped with a date. And it says the 18th of September, 1983. So it was a few months after Balanchine died that he made these shoes, and Suzanne went on to dance for a number of years after that. So, and then we have many adjustments. You see here is a thread that goes around the inside of the shoe. We pull that on so that it's fitted. And then we dump our heels in water and rosin. So we try and make this very unnatural shoe really into a piece of our foot, because what we really want to do is be, as Mr. Bay always wanted us to be, like pussycats. You know how they have these they land on their toes, they never land on their heels, and that they're very flexible. And he wanted no noise on stage. I'm sure all of you have been to the ballet where you hear on the stage, because these things are hard, because they have to be, but he wanted us to not make any noise. So before going on stage, once we battered the shoe like this, we'd go into the hallways at the theater, the cement kind of fire escape hallways, and we would take the shoes and we would bang them very hard and loud on the walls to get rid of the noise, because he did not like that clop on stage. So yes, it's an incredible invention. Marie Taglioni, who first and famously went on point, did not have shoes like that. I think she pretty much went up there on her own toes. I mean, she was a magnificent creature, and she did not have all the support. And the one other thing I'll say is that, you know, this is the box that is hard, even now that it's been worn, it's hard, and you could hear it when I stamp it. A lot of people think that might be metal or wood or something, but it's not. It's completely, it's layers of burlap and glue that harden, and therefore over time they will soften, so that now it's still pretty rough on your toes. No performing dancer has what you might think are pretty toes. I think they're quite beautiful. And there is a copy, a photo in the book of a dancer, but we get a lot of, calluses and knobs and bobs and blisters and band-aids, and our feet are quite a thing to see for being inside these shoes. But this is what raises us up on point, which you can't do otherwise. And also the way I see it, it raises the whole art form up. And it's an incredible expression of femininity. The men don't go in these shoes. I mean, some companies, people do different things, but basically it's an invention for the female dancer. So yeah, we love our toe shoes and we obsess about them. You will often see a dancer on the floor with 10 pairs around her, going through each shoe, trying to, mixing and matching pairs, and none of them are going to be good enough for that performance that night. It's a big thing for a dancer.
Well, you raise a topic that I think is an important one, which is the shoes are for the female dancer. And you say in the book, you're very insistent on this throughout the book, that Serenade is for the female, not just dancer, but for women, for women's strength, for women's power.
Yes.
And that in a way, it is the release of that power that is the power of the dance. So would you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, Balanchine famously said, ballet is woman. He famously loved women. He loved female dancers. Now, he made great parts. It's given some of the greatest parts ever for male dancers. But the female dancer for him, as it was for Petit Pas before him, was the pinnacle of the art form, because her capabilities physically are very different from a man's, rightly so. And Serenade, I mean, first of all, just in the numbers, there's 17 girls at the start and then 3 soloists. And then along the way, there are 6 men. There are 2 lead men, so 3 female soloists, 2 lead men, and then at the end, four guys that come in and help some of us do something in just one brief adagio scene, and we call them the blueberries. So it's very, 20 women, 6 men, and the women begin on stage, they end on stage, the men just come and go, which I take as kind of something I think Balanchine quite liked, the men to come and go, because, men can distract women from their work, right? So, I mean, he never used this word, and I'm not so fond of using it about him, but he truly was a feminist from the beginning. He loved us being independent. He made us more beautiful than we were, without a doubt. Our bodies, our minds, our spirits, our sense of morality. And so I lived in this world, a very unusual world, a unique world from the age of 10 on, knowing how just, when you think of how things are in our world in general, in our patriarchy, in a world where women were so valued and so adored and so promoted, and their power and their strength. I don't think there's a Balanchine ballet more than Serenade that shows this. And the greatest power in Serenade is of us together. While there are these incredible stories of a few individual dancers, the preponderance of the ballet is women together in a kind of a sisterhood. We're kind of, we're all servants together. We all serve each other. We serve the audience, and this incredible sense. And us dancers in real life have that now. As I said, a lot of us are, we're connected through Balanchine. We have this, this love for each other and respect for each other. So while I didn't know it, I was 10 years old, about feminism or all of this business, I realize now I grew up with this mindset that Balanchine gave us of our enormous importance. We were everything to him. We were everything to him. He said he devoted his life to that. He was a servant to that.
It's a fantastically interesting element, it seems to me, not only in Balanchine, but in Serenade. Is this something that makes it unique in ballet, in the history of ballet, do you think? that women, I mean, all of ballet is about the beauty of women to a great extent, but it's also about male dominance, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, Serenade is, I mean, yes, as you say, heretofore, I don't know how ballet is going to move forward. It has been, because Petipa, of course, the ballerina, was the foremost figure for him also. Now, and Petipa, just in case anyone doesn't know, is he made the great cornerstones of the classical canon, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker. And he made those live, so to speak, with Tchaikovsky. So you see, Tchaikovsky is really, I think, the spiritual, the musical father of all ballet, because he did those cornerstones that will always be with us in whatever their many versions, because who knows what really happened in the you know, when they were actually made. So the ballerina has always been at the forefront. Serenade is definitely, I don't know if Balanchine made a greater statement about women than he did then. And he was only 30 then, but he made many, you know, he made a total of 425 works, of which around 120 are extant and are sort of available now. Every one of them shows either many women or individual women in many portraits. I think the great critic Arlene Croce once wrote that if he had been a novelist, his portraits of women, I mean, he was like Henry James or something. He would be, you know, famous portraits of women, you know, of all types. On the one hand, his most sort of famously lyrical type is the beautiful, unobtainable woman, who Suzanne Farrell, for example, came to represent. That was maybe the highest, the great yearning of the artist for the unattainable woman, the beautiful woman, the mystical woman, the soulful woman. But he also loved, and we all, you know, knew this, he loved very tall women, very long legs. He liked bacchantes. He liked Amazon women. He liked Charlie's Angels. He liked women who were like big and strong and high kicking and, yes, jazzy hips. I mean, there's a big element of the erotic in Balanchine's work, needless to say. Yes, dominant women sometimes, fragile women, sad women. I mean, they're all there. They're all there.
You say at one point that Serenade deified democracy. You wrote this.
Yes.
Explain it a little bit.
Well, yes. Well, Serenade very much portrays this, you know, going back to this large cast of women well dressed alike, where, you know, visually you can't separate us. That the idea of democracy is, of course, that we're all equal, you know, for lack of a better explanation. But to me, he put us all there together, but then he raised us. We didn't go to the obvious lowest common denominator, as one might in a democracy. If everyone's included, you have to kind of begin at the bottom. But he kind of put us all together, but then he raised us all to ballerina status. So while there's also retained in Balanchine, as everywhere, a great hierarchy, because it's a very traditional ballet, classical art of, you know, ballerina, soloist, corps. It was often said, and it was true, that any of us, I was in the corps de ballet, any of us in the corps de ballet could have been a ballerina in a smaller company. Our training was such at the end of his life during my time, so at a peak of training. I mean, that is something that continues, but he's not there overseeing it in his way now, obviously. But so I feel like he made us all queens, which is kind of, it's a paradox, but all great things are paradoxical, yeah, right?
Exactly, that's what I was getting.
So we were all on pedestals, and I write something about he raised us all up, but there was enough room on the pedestal for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but he was a Democrat in other ways as well, right?
Not politically. He was
not politically,
okay.
but in terms of his human world.
Oh yes, oh yes.
you write about the fact that the ballerinas appeared in alphabetical order.
Yes. Yes. Well, he was very against something that exists and always will in the ballet world, certainly during sort of the times I'm writing about, mostly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Celebrity, what we call celebrity culture now, of famous dancers, notably, for example, Margot Fonteyn and Rudolf Nureyev, who would sell out houses like rock stars. It was like the Rolling Stones. People would wait for days and hawk tickets and stuff. That was not of interest to Balanchine at all. And he, at one point, I think during my years, it went back to a listing of, at the beginning of the company, they would have principal, soloists, and corps. But for a long time in the, I think maybe 60s and 70s, when the audiences were getting too keen on specific, like, I just want to see somebody dance in whatever, they focused too much on the individual personalities. Balanchine didn't like that, and he alphabetized the entire program so that, Suzanne Farrell would be under F, and B as Bentley, I would be above her, right? This was a symbolic statement, of course, that his art is not about ego. And it is not, in a famous kind of exchange with Nureyev, the great Rudolf Nureyev, who always wanted, when he came to the West, the most famous original defector, he wanted, of course, as part of that, to dance all different things, all different places, with all the great artists. And of course, the greatest artist everybody knew living was Balanchine. But I think over the years, there were a number of conversations, but Balanchine would not take him into the company because he knew the ego, the need to play the prince was too inborn. It would never go away. And Nureyev didn't say he wanted it to go away. So there was a kind of a not very successful collaboration with Nureyev that was really quite sad, of Bourgeois Gentilhomme for the New York City Opera, not with City Ballet. And during that time, Balanchine got ill and wasn't even able to really participate in it. And he said to Nureyev, I think somewhere along the way, he said, when you're tired of being the prince, come to me. And he never did. So Mr. B, while on the one hand, we were all queens and princesses, we did not act that way. We knew we were beyond that. I mean, not to be ridiculous, but really we knew better than that. If you are doing all that work and devoting your whole life and getting no education, I barely graduated high school, you have nothing to do after, you make no money unless you're Nureyev. I mean, it's a complete rarity. A couple of dancers made money. If you give all of that, to me, it has to be for something a lot more than, kind of fame or ego gratification. That is not enough payment for all that you give up. You want something, I think, higher and better than that. Yeah. Maybe a little bit of transcendence along the way.
Well, you had a moment of transcendence, and we're kind of getting to the end here, but I did want to include this if we can. Mm-hmm. You had, it seemed to me, a moment of transcendence when you visited him in the hospital.
Yes. Yes.
And there's an extraordinary moment that you refer to, you write about in your book. It's poetic, it's beautiful, and very touching. And it connects that moment of physical contact with the physicality of the ballet itself. And in a way, all of his approach to the world, that he has to feel it, he has to touch it. My father was a bookseller, and he said, if you want to know about the books, you have to touch the books. You can't just read the books. You have to touch them, you have to smell them, you have to feel them. And would you read that section?
Sure, I will, yes. So this, I think you sort of set this up, but this was the last time I saw him before he died. And it was just a few months before. He was in the hospital for many months at Roosevelt Hospital. They didn't know what was wrong with him until after he died. So I went to visit him and there was nobody there. And so this was my little meeting with him. Let me just get the page here. He reached out and took my left hand in his right, and I felt the warm current of his energy. Finally ready, willing at 0 hour. I almost cried, feeling the sweetness, the closeness, but stayed quiet, watching him while he watched me. Then he let go and moved his hand up to my wrist slowly, feeling my skin, circling his fingers around my small wrist, then up to my forearm. It was not the first time he had taken my wrist, touched my hand or arm. Ballet is a physical profession, and he had been moving me around, adjusting head, legs, feet, fingers in class and rehearsals for well over 10 years, since I was 11 years old as a child dancing in the Nutcracker. Our entire profession is about being in a particular shape in three-dimensional space. Rearranging bodies and body parts was the choreography he did all day long with us in the theater. But the circumstances here were different, more personal, and the unspoken sadness of finality invaded me. I was with him entirely in a calm accord that I had not had with him before. My resisting fear finally absented itself for this last dance. He moved his hand up to my elbow, feeling the size and shape of my arm and shoulders through my thin blouse, across the bones of my clavicle, my neck, and then traveling sideways to my other shoulder, and then down that arm, taking hold of my right hand, a symmetrical surveillance. Never has anyone touched me with such gentle deliberation as Mr. B did on his deathbed that day. In what was likely only a minute in clock time, he made in his dying grace an invisible girl feel visible. One final adjustment.
Very beautiful. The whole book is, Toni, I congratulate you. I think if Mr. B were here, he would be very grateful for this book. And I know that all who love him and his ballet will be grateful to me. I know it's gotten fabulous attention, so congratulations on this.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It means so much to have talked with you about this with your audience.
Well, I think we really are out of time, and we would like to open up for some questions. I see that there are a bunch of questions. Alex,
so sure.
handle
Thank
that?
you both so much. This has been really lovely. A few questions from the audience, and if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the Q&A now. One thing that one viewer was curious about is, are there any films of Serenade that you would recommend?
Yes. Well, first and foremost, I don't like any films of ballets. I mean, the only dance film I really like is The Red Shoes, but it's been all but downhill since then, because, you know, obviously it's the point of view of the camera, not your own, and all of the problems with film. That said, it might be better than nothing if you don't have access to see a live performance, which is not always easy. There are on YouTube quite a few. The one I would recommend that I used mostly to do the timings in my book, I think it's posted by John Clifford, and it's in color. It's from 1990. So it was just after Balanchine died in 83, but it's with all Balanchine trained ballerinas, which means a lot to me. Darcy Kistler, Maria Caligari, Kira Nichols are the three lead ballerinas. And it was shot by Judy Kinberg, who had worked with Balanchine when he had originally done some television in the late 70s. And it's about as good as you'll get in terms of a film. And you can see the whole thing on there, about 32, 33 minutes.
Wonderful. Another viewer has asked about the religious, and perhaps we could add ethnic national diversity among the dancers. Could you speak a little bit about the Balanchine dancers?
During his time, could you repeat the question again?
A viewer asked about the religious diversity among the Balanchine dancers, and I said perhaps we could add to that other sense of diversity, national and ethnic.
Yes. Well, obviously in the theater, our religion was ballet and Balanchine. I think, you know, in terms of people's private lives, it ran the gamut as it does in society. Um, what we were all very aware of religiously was, and he did not ever talk about it or proselytize, but it was part of his, when it's infused in his work, is that Balanchine was quite devoutly Russian Orthodox. So as I say, I mean, he didn't proselytize, he didn't teach us, but we knew that when the Russian holidays came around, he was not in the theater, he was at home cooking, and he was a famously good cook, everything from scratch. He would make all the traditional dishes. And in terms of during my years there, I mean, yes, it's quite notable now. He brought in at a time when it wasn't common at all, if ever, he brought in Arthur Mitchell, the great Black dancer in the 60s. And in fact, in Agon, in Stravinsky's Agon, he paired Arthur Mitchell with Suzanne Farrell, a very pale white ballerina, and this actually caused some controversy. This was right there during, you know, all the civil rights in the mid 60s, and it was a fantastic thing, but it was very daring. And Balanchine then went on to help Arthur Mitchell create Dance Theater of Harlem, which I believe was the first all black ballet, you know, classical ballet company. Which is fantastic. And then, you know, we had all kinds of people in the company. It was, you know, and Balanchine loved that. He also loved sisters. He always loved, I say in the book once, he said to me in class one day, you know, any question from him was like, oh God, am I going to fail or what? He said to me, are you Italian? And clearly I maybe, you know, because of my coloring or something. And I felt like, well, I really had to fail that one when I told him that I was Australian, which is just so not romantic. He had a lot of sets of sisters in the company, but he loved to know people's origins and ethnic things. He considered us all family. So, you know, it was a big family.
Wonderful. And when you mentioned Suzanne Farrell and you showed her shoes, one viewer is asking if you're still in touch with Suzanne, or if you can tell us a little bit more.
Well, I'm not in touch with her that much right now. I mean, if they want to know what she's doing right now, I think she lives in the Southwest, and I know she recently staged Serenade for a small kind of student ballet company run by someone who danced for her in her company that she had at Lincoln, not Lincoln Center, at the Kennedy Center in Washington. She staged Serenade for them just a few months ago, actually. So, you know, I wrote her, my second book after my first memoir was her autobiography. So that was a great thing in my life that she asked me to do that. And I got to talk to the Sphinx-like woman to get the secrets. And try as I might, I think the book is very good, but as we talked about with Balanchine, genius reveals no secrets. I can't explain why Suzanne Farrell was the greatest dancer I ever saw, and many of us I think ever saw, and Balanchine said the greatest dancer he ever saw. His favorite male dancer, by the way, was Fred Astaire.
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to stop. Toni, Jonathan, thank you so much. This has been such a fantastic, fascinating program. And for all of our viewers out there, we do recommend that you pick up a copy. We put the link in the chat box. And thank you so much for joining us. We've got a lot of interesting programs coming up this fall. We hope you'll check out all the links that we just shared.
Thank you so much.
You,
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Toni.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Jonathan. Bye.
Yeah, thanks so much.